That takes us to a new topic, though. I would say that, let's talk about governments now and the role of governments and what more they can do to transform Africa's infrastructure, particularly on a pan-African scale, getting governments to cooperate. And I'll start with you, Charlie. In these frontier markets, it must be a very, one of your biggest concerns is political stability.
Well, I mean, one of the most significant challenges, I think, facing the governments in some of the more frontier markets is the capacity and the experience. And they may be governments who are in place for very short periods of time. And, having that sort of long-term perspective is also quite often lacking in some of these governments. And there's also the issue of corruption. And, you'll very often, I've seen it in a number of countries we work in, where the private sector are not responsible, and the interplay between the government and the private sector is poorly managed, and you get contractors building roads, you get sort of power or utility producers who quite frankly are irresponsible, and they're not up to the task of delivering the infrastructure that they're paid to deliver. So I think a lot could be done to work with governments, particularly development banks, working with governments to improve that relationship.
If the people on the ground are no good, essentially you're throwing good money after bad, I suppose. If you can pour as much money as you like in, if the people there on the ground are not going to be doing a good job with it, what can you do?
I think it's about institutional frameworks, and we've seen that happen in a number of countries, and Tryon and others on the island will probably see that. Yeah. We've seen in a number of countries, especially Lagos State, for instance, and Nigeria as a whole, where they've put together what you call an infrastructure concession and regulatory commission. Yeah. And what does that do is essentially have a fairly more standard model, because if those of us that are experiencing doing PPPs and infrastructure in Europe, the PPAs you would negotiate on one project is not going to be extremely different from what you would in another project. They are basically standard models. So essentially the institutional framework whereby there's a standardized procurement process and a tender process that allows strong sponsors to emerge from those that are interested is absolutely important. But I don't think it's just the role of development banks alone. I think private institutions as well as private equity players also need to contribute to strengthening the institutional capacity of some of those fairly new institutions, because they simply do not necessarily have as much knowledge or cross border experience as to what has been done in Korea that has worked well, or the UK, or in different, or even within Africa. I mean, we've had in Cameroon, for instance, the power utility, or in Uganda, has been working on a private model for quite a long time. Why are we not able to replicate that in Ghana or in Nigeria and other places? So I think we all have a role to engage with the PPP offices and or the infrastructure regulatory commission, so that we can help migrate best practice to them. Because if we don't spend as much time in helping them to build that capacity, we would actually find it difficult to deploy money that we may well have. I'm sure that for Africa Development Bank, they would wish to do a lot more power projects, for instance, in Nigeria, in Ghana, or Kenya, for that matter. The issue is that you need a framework that can actually receive that money and put it to work in a manner that will provide a return for debt repayments, which I'm really worried about, and of course provide a good IRR for equity investors on both sides of the table.
Can I come in here?
Yes, of course.
Some ask, what is the African bank doing in private sector? Private sector doesn't need our money. We don't have so much money. The conditions we offer are not so different from private sector players. I think the difference is that we are a risk mitigator. And we mitigate the risk of having to deal with government. And we offer some kind of a bridge between the public sector and the private sector. And this is part of the response of why many private sector players come to see us, to ask us to be part of the project, to co-finance the project. It's not our expertise, not our money, nothing else. It's the risk mitigation aspect. And the same applies in every part of the world with the IFC or other regional banks.
Charlie, just to add to that, because one of our central role in the risk mitigation which is of interest to all others around the table who finance in Africa, is of course the legal and regulatory framework. That's an area where we work closely with the governments and in partnership with other development partners, the World Bank, the FCS, etc. was mentioned. That's one. The second, of course, is the business environment. In Rwanda, for example, now, it takes you that much less number of days to actually open a business, whereas 10 years ago, it used to take you years to open a business. So those sort of business environment we work on. Of course, there is the overall macro framework, which in close collaboration with the IMF, the World Bank, these are areas where we work with the government to make sure then that the private sector can come in and operate with much less constraint. But of course, on the government side, there is still the important factor of internal security. Internal security, which, talking of risks, when you think of Africa as a whole, there are 14 countries called fragile states. These are states that have come from some form of insecurity, civil war, etc. And as they move from fragility to resilience, this is an area that the African Development Bank is focused on, helping these countries to make sure that the procurement practices are back to up to scratch, helping these countries to make sure that the budgets are transparent, helping these countries essentially in state building. Yeah. Because if you think of Haiti, when the cameras go away, the real challenge begins of building Haiti. And that's the time when people like the African Development Bank are in there, the unsung heroes. There's no television cameras, they're all gone. So state building we have to take into account. Sudan is a major, major challenge to all of us.
Actis, how do you manage your relationships with the governments in the countries where you are, particularly the fragile states that were mentioned by Aloysius, and particularly when there's not a lot of transparency, when there's, all these different, perhaps, ethical concerns. How do you manage these relationships with governments?
Just what we heard here from Africa Development Bank underlines exactly what I mentioned before, making sure you have credit enhancement, making sure that we have a credit-worthy off-taker. And if you're looking at the power sector, infrastructure in general, but power sector, this is a government which will be the counterpart. There is no deregulated private market working, so you're dealing with the governments and only with the governments. Then it's a question on how do you therefore make sure that you do have a working relationship with them that creates a bankable project. And there's a multitudes of ways of doing that, but the Africa Development Banks of the world, or if the IFC, World Bank, the DFI community, they are very important to be in that relationships. You have the government, the investors, and then you need the parties who can then provide the credit enhancement being there. And I think that also, if you're looking from a transparency point of view and so on, having institutions like the IFCs or the World Banks or the Africa Development Bank involved, they make sure that there actually was a proper process. It were actually done in the correct way, and then you get the private sector into the right deals. And I think a beauty with private investors is that if you're thinking about what you mentioned before, build a government paying people to build infrastructure, that's a difficult area to be in from a bribe point of view, because government giving money to someone to do something. But as an investor, you're not going to bribe yourself. So so it will not happen in the private sector. The issue is in the question of did we have the correct bidding process? Did the right people win the deal? And that's where you can have the IFCs and the World Banks playing an important role. And for us to go into a deal where we're going to have a commitment in that country for 20 years plus, we have to make sure that it's not going to be challenged by the next government or the next regulator who's coming in, but actually it was awarded in a proper, transparent process. So I think it's for us to work with the multilaterals, therefore, is crucial in that stage.
Yeah.